Um, Good morning, everyone. If you are from this time zone, which I don't know where you all are joining me from, but good afternoon, evening, wherever you are at the moment. Thank you for joining and participating in this book launch event for Sam Hunt's new book, Interfacing Death. We'll get to that in a second. Just some brief prefatory notes. In terms of format, the way it's going to work is I'll start with some brief introductions. I'll then get the ball rolling by asking some questions, and we'll have some time at the end, maybe the last 10 minutes or so, to open it up for questions and discussion. So about me, my name is Vinay. I just finished my PhD at the Department of Sociology at the State University of New York at Buffalo. Now back in Singapore and about to begin a stint as a research fellow at the National Institute of Education at Nanyang Technological University here. Sam is currently a senior lecturer of anthropology and sociology, deputy director of the Korea Research Center of Western Australia at the University of Western Australia. Prior to this, Sam was an associate professor of sociology at the Nanyang Technological University here in Singapore, where I had the fortune and privilege of studying with him during the course of my master's. His research writing mainly focuses on a range of topics spanning social, cultural, critical theory, new media studies, religion, United States, East Asia, and other unlikely bedfellows. His previous books, it's a long list, but I'll stick to a few of them, include Web 2.0, from 2011, Technologies of Religion, 2016, Digital Culture and Religion in Asia, also from 2016. Today, however, we'll focus on the latest in his ever-expanding oeuvre, Interfacing Death, Life in Global Uncertainty, published earlier this year by Routledge. I should point out that there is a discount code available for the book on the event website. For this on this conference page. So be sure to check that out. So let's get into the book. Sam, I'm wondering if you can just kind of give us a brief overview, a broad overview of what the book's about. How did you come to write it? Some sense of its contents, perhaps.
Thanks, Vinay, and thanks everyone for coming. Yeah, so the book kind of stems from my interest in the sociology of religion and new media studies. So I would say the last kind of 8 years, I've been sort of focused on something called, something that I call the cultural and media studies of religion. And I was trying to sort of move away from institutional religions or religions qua religions and sort of move towards questions that have to do with religiosity, but that may not necessarily be sort of identifiable as religion. So I thought the question of death was one where I could sort of do that. I also was convinced that death was a kind of a rare moment, excuse me, in sort of our secular world, where kind of questions, kind of notions of the sacred and ritual and other sort of religion terms or religious terms sort of kind of remained. So I thought that was sort of an interesting way of also exploring our quote unquote secular condition. As for the book itself, it sort of begins with this notion of the interface. So I've long been a reader and maybe even fan of the work of media theorist Alex Galloway. And Galloway has this book on the interface, and Galloway's particular sort of, I would say, argument has to do with replacing Frederick Jameson's idea of ideology. So if ideology was sort of the way in which we could kind of symptomatically diagnose the contemporary moment, for Galloway, a better way of doing that, which attends to digitality, was the interface. So I thought that was a way of thinking about death as well, because I'm really interested in how death sort of is mediated and how it emerges in various media practices across the world, and also what that may mean for this kind of broader argument around having overcome death or having sort of sidelined or sequestered death.
Okay. I'm guessing you wrote this book in like 2018 or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was thinking about this while reading it about how kind of prescient some of the themes are, given now that we are living in this pandemic-strewn era. So one of the themes that I wanted to pick up on that I'm kind of interested in is this idea of the digital proliferation of death and how it's so ubiquitous and in your face and possibly banal. I'm just curious if you could speak to the implications of this. Like, what are the, say, ontological implications? Like, what happens to subjectivity when spectators are constantly viewing death and being so kind of inundated by images of death, even the ones that are framed as tragic? So I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think, and this was actually sort of the topic that I just spoke on at my previous panel. Yeah, so that chapter in particular is, I was trying to juxtapose two images. One is the image of Alan Kurdi, who is a Syrian boy. He was washed ashore, and that image of his sort of body on the beach kind of circulated. And I was juxtaposing that with the various images and videos of Philando Castile, who was a young black man who was murdered by the police in St. Paul, Minnesota. And what's interesting about Castile's case is that his partner, who was with him in the car when he was pulled over for a broken taillight, was that she turned on Facebook Live after he had been shot. And I wanted to sort of juxtapose those two images because I thought, obviously, the image of Alan Kurdi washed up on the beach sort of circulated and went viral, and I believe was on the cover of over 40 newspapers across the world. And there was a lot of, in that particular chapter, I explore sort of the discourse around the use of that image. I kind of look at the discourse of photo editors, and in particular, I believe one of the sort of head honchos at Getty Images suggests that that image is sort of rare for many reasons, especially because it violates a lot of policy, not kind of legal policy, but sort of in-house policy around the circulation of images of dead children in particular. But he and others suggest that there was a moral imperative to do so. And I think so I view that in the context of the kind of proliferation of images of young black men and young black women killed at the hands of the police. And this was before, obviously, the images of George Floyd from earlier this year as well. So I was trying to see how certain deaths are tragic or viewed as tragic or talked about as tragic, and how others are not. And in order to explore that, I draw on the work of W.J.T. Mitchell, the art historian, who has this idea of the meta picture. And just to sort of put it briefly, the idea is that an image, especially the digital era, is of course kind of the image that is in relation to the thing or the scene that's captured, but also how it's circulated, how it's repurposed, how it's framed, how it's contextualized. And I thought I just wanted to sort of explore whether the circulation of images and which images get circulated and how they're talked about kind of determine our appetite for kind of framing this within the idea of tragedy. And of course, the kind of social theory question there is around the work of Luc Boltanski, that famous notion of the politics of pity. And where I sort of arrive at is, that certain deaths are not viewed as tragic, and certain deaths are. And, to kind of to go back to your question, Vinay, around, COVID-19, there on CNN, there's a running count on the right side of the screen of how many deaths and infections there are in the US and in the world. And of course, there are images, countless images that we've seen of kind of hospital settings and intensive care wards where people are very much kind of struggling to breathe. And there's a whole kind of team of medical professionals attending to them. And I wonder whether we're able to, in spite of the fact that we're able to see those images and sort of scroll through them on our feeds, whether we actually have a capacity to understand those deaths as tragic, or are they simply sort of statistical personages? Are they just numbers adding up to the count? Is the tragedy the count, or is the tragedy the suffering? Oftentimes you see in contemporary discourse around COVID-19 that the tragedy, especially in the United States, is the failure of governance to deal with the pandemic, right? So the tragedy is not necessarily the suffering itself, but the failure of governance. And I wanted to sort of explore these issues. And, you know, I had no idea that there'd be a global pandemic.
Yeah, that would be a totally different conversation.
Yeah.
If I can pick up on some of the things that you just mentioned, one of the things that you said was about this, that there was this kind of moral imperative to publish this photo of the kid who passed away, who drowned and was washed up on the shore. I think it was in Turkey, right? And that, I think you discuss this in the book, like it struck a kind of moral chord. There was a kind of ethical resonance where I think it even went on to change policy, influence some of the immigration policies and the whether countries were going to take in refugees and something like that. So it was clearly a very powerful moment. Now I'm wondering, one of the things that I'm curious about, and I think is for some reason in my mind after looking at your book, is this idea of under what conditions, like how do we understand why this uneven distribution of attention, emotion, moral outrage, and even a kind of call to social action, right? Where we've seen with now with climate change and the recent, the global protests over the Black Lives Matter, there's been widespread protests. But on the other hand, there is also this kind of, I guess, a desensitizing effect, or a slope in which we can sort of slide into a politics of pity or a sensibility of pity and just kind of move on from the whole thing. Especially when death is kind of interspersed with our social media feeds, with the latest activities of Justin Bieber or whatnot. So yeah, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, how do we understand this kind of uneven nature of the response?
Yeah, I mean, immediately I think of the work of Judith Butler around the notion of grievable life, what lives are grievable, what lives are not. But it also makes me think of the work of Orlando Patterson, and in particular his work on slavery and social death. And I say this on purpose because I think obviously Patterson's argument is that slavery was social death, and that in effect, the legacy of slavery is a kind of coming out of that death position. And to be fair, Patterson looks at a situation beyond the United States. Patterson has a comparative sort of look. And Patterson's work, which isn't really discussed in sociology, I would say, but it has been picked up recently in African-American literary studies. There's a whole emergent literature around Afro-pessimism. And there have been great debates around Afro-pessimism for those who are interested and want like not quick actually, but a kind of a journalistic overview of that. I would highly recommend my buddy Vincent Cunningham of The New Yorker, who's written quite nicely around the idea of Afro-pessimism. And I think one of the kind of lessons of Afro-pessimism is that, can we mourn lives of those whose lives were never fully out of death, who are always socially dead? And I think the movement for Black Lives poses that question: how many more? And that's something that I think it's a question that I think deserves a lot of reckoning. Why are some lives call to actions and some lives they are call to actions, but why do they not result in lasting legislative change or social change? I think in some ways, perhaps. And this is sort of a transition to the project that I'm working on now, which is actually a book on the concept of tragedy for the social sciences. I would say the tragic frame, and this is something that Boltanski also gets at, maybe doesn't work anymore. If you look at the work of, for instance, the social movement sociologists, of the 50s and 60s in the United States, Todd Gitlin, even the resource mobilization folks, there's this idea that there was a moral appeal, and that the reason why SNCC and other civil rights organizations were effective was because they were able to make a moral appeal through the media. That's why Todd Gitlin's book is called The Whole World is Watching. And that sort of spectatorship worked. And I think the work of Boltanski and others basically signals that perhaps suffering does not necessarily equate to, or the spectating of suffering does not necessarily equate to any sort of call to action, or at least, long-lasting legislative or political change. And I think, the project that I'm at work on now kind of explores whether the tragic frame works. What is its connection to contemporary sort of moral outrage and other things? So, yeah, I mean, that doesn't really answer your question, but that's where my head is at regarding those things.
Okay, you've already talked a little bit about your next project. So I'm going to stop talking and open it up to audience questions, if anyone has something.
Yeah, Adam, go for it.
I'll jump in. Thanks. I really enjoyed the talk, and I'm looking forward to reading your book, probably during the break. But with your book, so you speak about the differences with social media, but have you find what key differences have you find from the age of television, the age of the internet, and now the age of social media? Have you seen some processes being changed, or is this an acceleration or something, or an emphasis on certain aspect?
Yeah, thanks, Adam. I think I haven't really sort of periodized it in that manner, but I think there's something to be said about, and I take this in large part from Galloway and Mitchell. I think what's happening now is there's a certain level of, I think circulation is one thing, but I think repurposing is another. The early work of people like Siva Bhajanathan and Lawrence Lessig, they talk about the remix culture. And I think today we have that, but sort of on steroids. And that sort of intensification of repurposing is quite different from television, for instance, where television is largely receptive. What we have now is, and this is, an awful sort of word that people still use, is that, the prosumer, the very act of receiving is the very act of producing. I mean, this is simply the case even when we're scrolling passively in our social media feeds, because, what we hover over, what we like, what we comment on, all of that produces and generates not only data, but also value. And that sort of platforming of our sort of online existence, I think, has a lot of, I think that's quite different from the age of television, for instance. And this is not necessarily related to my work, but even if you look at advertising models now, it is so different. I think, that golden age of, Madison Avenue, where it was largely, to put it kind of, simplistically, it was psychoanalytic. How do we tap into latent desire? That sort of classic Marcuse kind of analysis. I think it's quite, we have that, of course. I think, Facebook, for instance, knows what we want before we even know we want it, right? So how do we rethink, for instance, repressive desublimation in today's era? How do we kind of connect this idea that we are feeding Facebook things that it feeds us, there's a feedback mechanism, a loop. I think that, and how do companies capture that? I think the major question is not only around presumption, but also value and labor. And I think that's sort of where a lot of the work on digital labor is. And it's sort of, it's a big kind of lacuna in my own work, but it's clear that that's really where kind of the social analysis and social thinking around contemporary media needs to go, which is, big data, whatever that means, but, are also kind of, and this goes back to Vinay's question, what does it mean ontologically? I think it may mean that, we can't I think the figure of the individual or the figure of the spectator or the figure of the subject has to be sort of supplemented by other figures. My sort of personal favorite in this regard is Deleuze's notion of the individual. Or assemblage or any other sort of model that kind of speaks to the fact that, phenomenologically we perhaps exist as subjects, but for these various platforms, we are, whatever our thumbs hover over, whatever we comment on, whatever we've sort of browsed, right? But thanks for that question, Adam.
Thanks for the answer.
Any other questions?
Hello, can I ask a question?
Hey, Utari, how are you?
Hello, I'm good, Sam. Sorry, I cannot use the camera.
No, all good, all good. Utari is a student at UWA.
Yeah. So definitely I haven't read your book. I'm looking forward to it. But then listening to your explanation now, I'm thinking about how through YouTube, for example, we have videos. I haven't watched those videos because I'm just too scared. How the terrorists, when they're beheading people and then they put it on the YouTube in a way to recruit people. And what can you say about it? Because you also mentioned in the description of the book that on the other side, we are also trying to make death or something is more personalized. Now it's not open. It's part of the homes, part of even the funeral is now more private than it used to be. But what is going on there? I mean, in that kind of situation.
Yeah, thanks, Utari. Just to speak to your first question around the terrorist beheading videos, my analysis of that draws on a lot of other policy experts that argue that the way in which sort of public discourse has understood terrorist beheading videos has kind of fallen back on this kind of Sam Huntington class of civilizations, jihad versus McWorld kind of narrative. Whereas if one does an analysis of the videos themselves, like a like a narrative analysis of the videos themselves, the videos actually mirror Western news content. The videos are very much edited in a way, in particular the Daesh videos, the ISIS videos, they're meant for Western audiences because of course they're recruiting from their recruiting pool are young people in France, Belgium, Germany, etc. And why that's sort of important to point out here is that Daesh is not quote unquote barbaric because they're showing the beheadings. What they're doing is actually they're mirroring the kind of format of CNN, and it kind of the analysis that I try to present there is that how much of something like terrorist beheading videos are a reflection of how we treat death in the media in the first place, in the news media in particular. And to kind of address your second question around the way in which death enters our homes and funerals and things, yeah, I think there's a certain kind of argument to be made around like a criticism of this notion that death has been kind of handled. So there's a long line of historical work and sociological work that suggests that we've overcome death in modernity. We no longer die in our homes. We die in hospitals. We have funerals in funeral homes. Everything's become specialized. And this has turned into a kind of alienated experience. Perhaps with COVID-19, there's something else going on. I don't know how to analyze that because it's sort of happening right now. But I do wonder whether we have to rethink that argument, the death denial argument that, in modernity, we've sort of, one of the things that we've overcome is death, and that death has been sanitized. I think in some ways, death is more present than ever through media, but that doesn't necessarily kind of induce a kind of moral response, as Vinay was suggesting, that we have developed a certain kind of capacity or tolerance for viewing death. And I'm trying to kind of think through that now in my work on tragedy, because tragedy was, in the classical sense, the form that was supposed to explain death for us. It provided a kind of theodicy for us. And I wonder today, with death being ever present, high def, so available, whether we still have that kind of allergy to death, and that we simply have somehow incorporated it and have, it's just part of our life. And what does that mean then for things like the mobilization of politics? How does that help us think through notions of social justice and things like that? So yeah, that's all sort of part of my thinking as it's happening now.
Thanks, thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Utari.
All right, it seems like we have a couple of minutes left.
Can I ask a question?
Sure. Is it Sharon? Hi, Sharon.
So I have a question for you, and it's kind of around a little bit of, I guess, touches a little bit on the two questions on what we're going through in the pandemic, and how you think that that's changed in terms of our connections with death. Hearing about 120,000 people, or I don't even know how many in America have died, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, 250,000.
Or 1 million, right? Sure. Or, double donuts in Melbourne, right? So kind of those cultural perceptions of death, and how you think those two cultures kind of are going to be viewing and engaging, depending on obviously where they're coming from. And then I guess the other question is kind of, my idea was how you're thinking about media and multimedia, and if you bring in notions of like Gina Gershon's polymedia stuff into your work. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Those are very good questions. I think the first question, I think, one of the questions I have is, how are we going to memorialize this time? We have, huge statues for events with far fewer deaths, to be honest. And if we're talking about 250,000 deaths now, and perhaps maybe upwards of 300,000 in the United States at a certain point, how are we going to remember this? And that's a question for people who do memory studies. And I think it's a question that I think will be answered in the years to come. I don't know. So one of the things that I was listening to a podcast, and the two co-hosts were talking about who the Time Person of the Year is going to be this year. And, the guesses were, is it going to be the virus? Is it going to be, Tony Fauci? And then behind Tony Fauci, like a big, like a whole host of kind of frontline medical workers, et cetera. I think it's a question around memory and how we situate ourselves culturally to this event. And that's why I'm so interested in tragedy, because so much of tragedy revolves around the figure of the hero and the figure of the flaw. And I wonder how much of that is going to be sort of incorporated into our commemorative practices. As it pertains to the sort of media theory that I use, I stick pretty close to the work of Galloway, but also I'm pretty taken by recent work on the notion of mediatization, Knut Lundby, as well as others in Scandinavia, and also figures like Nick Coldry in the UK. And to sort of simplify that and oversimplify that, their argument is that the logic of media now has pervaded other sort of social spheres. And I sort of tend to be on the side of Coldry that suggests that that's not a recent phenomena. That's always historically been the case. So the way that I look at it is through kind of mediatization, but also mediation. So contemporary digital culture I view as sort of intensifying processes of mediation that have existed prior to. Yes, there are new and novel things, and of course new dynamics, but there is something to be said for how mediation has occurred throughout time. I rely on the work of people in what's called media archaeology, who've done this work. So that's sort of my own theoretical proclivity, but of course, the work of figures, as you mentioned, is very kind of key. I don't have a particular sort of perspective. I'm sort of like agnostic when it comes to this stuff. There's a chapter in the book where I talk about celebrity studies, and I'm going back to Diane and Katz, you know, the notion of media events. And what I try to do is to sort of try to be kind of ecumenical in my approach to all this. So yeah, but I do think that it's worth thinking about what digitality poses, what sort of affordances and what sort of limitations are posed by digitality, and what sort of practices emerge out of digitality. Because I think it's not simply the same. I think that the arguments around, oh, this is simply just an extension of television, or this is simply an extension of newspapers, I think that's sort of misguided, because it's that they're not looking at the way in which specific practices are emerging. And Utari's kind of mentioning of YouTube is perfect. I think YouTube is sort of where you see all of this sort of come together, where the kind of conspiratorial Alex Joneses of the world come, and also where the sort of young influencers, you know, who are trying to debunk the, you know, the conspirators or all conspiratorial, the conspiracy theorists are also kind of living side by side, and depending on your own viewing habits, they sort of emerge magically. So yeah, I mean, I didn't really answer your question, Sharon, but yeah, that's sort of where, you know, I'm situated.
All right, technically we are out of time, but I want to ask if anyone has any last final questions before we call this a day.
Oh, and Sharon, I see your comment here. That's a very good point. Australia's version of this memory is quite different than that of the US. Absolutely, I take that point.
All right, and with that, I think is there another question?
No, that was a comment from Utari. Yes, yes, of course, burial practices and the restrictions on burial practices. I think if you look at, you know, societies that are kind of on the pew, for instance, that rank sort of levels of religiosity and levels of secularity, you'll see that there are, you know, greater sort of concerns around burial practices and funeral practices, for sure.
Okay. So with that, thank you. Congratulations, Sam, on this book. I think everyone is looking forward to reading it. I'm looking forward to completing it. Thanks everyone for joining, and I wish you well in the remaining sessions.
Thanks, Vinay, and thanks everyone for sticking around.